Afternoon. I hope you've had a great session so far. Hello to our wonderful panelists here today. My name's Videesha. I'm a partner at Signals VC. It's a new venture capital firm based here in Berlin. We invest between 1 and 3 million euros in data-driven companies. If you're interested in discussing your company with me, then talk to me afterwards. I now allow the panelists to introduce themselves.
Johnston. I founded a business called Nitrous. So we are about helping GovTech businesses to accelerate their engagement with government, build pipeline, and become more valuable businesses. And part of that model is helping them raise investment and scale.
So I'm Witter. I'm the co-founder of Apolitical. I really consider myself a political entrepreneur, sort of political first, entrepreneur second. So my whole career has been about looking at a problem in politics or policy and then using businesses to solve that problem. The company I've co-founded now is a company called Apolitical, and we're the first peer-to-peer platform global that helps governments find the ideas and solutions, which often means GovTech companies, that they need to improve the lives of citizens. Right now we have more than 100 countries using our platform to solve policy and procurement problems.
And my name is Benjamin Nanz. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Civocracy, and we essentially work with people to make better decisions with their government collectively. So we're a civic tech company. We work predominantly in France and the Netherlands, but are based in Berlin. And we're a socially driven company, so we believe that how we make decisions kind of socially with the government and kind of bridging that gap is one of the major problems of kind of the modern age. So that's what we address.
Perfect. So to the panelists, there's a partner in the US who's running a US-focused GovTech fund. And what he says is that the GovTech market is a $400 billion market in plain sight. How do you think about the GovTech market? How do you define it? What do you think it is?
You want to take it first?
Yeah, let's do it. Can I refuse? No. So I think that there needs to be a definition around the GovTech market. I think we all might have our different definitions, but personally for myself, I see the biggest low-hanging fruit opportunity in actually helping the businesses that are already selling into very large organizations optimize their businesses for selling into what is a much harder market to sell into, and that is government, because of many different reasons, with regulation, product readiness, security. So I would actually say it's the B2B, it's the cybersecurity, machine learning, HR technologies, accountancy kind of solutions which are going to transform government, and that I would call GovTech.
Well, just to push on that a little bit, and then maybe give my description. When we first started our company, people were like, oh, why did you pick such a hard road going into government? You're never going to be able to sell into government. And government's actually been easier to sell into than other markets. So I really think some of it is myth-busting around that. It gets repeated over and over again. Why is it easy? Well, if you have a service or a company that solves a problem that no one else is going to solve for them, we've been able to be sole-sourced. It's really easy to sell in to government. You maybe have to do a little extra paperwork, but that's fine, because as a citizen, I actually want my governments being thoughtful about where to do procurement. I do think that it is a massive opportunity. The average OECD government, which Germany is one of them, spends 40% of its GDP on government itself. So you just can do the math about how big this market is. And if you were to move 1% of that, 50% more efficiently, that's $150 billion. So I think that this is a huge market, and we'll get to probably why, the reasons why people haven't been playing in the space. I mean, if you're a hardcore entrepreneur, you run to the hard. You love hard, or else you wouldn't be an entrepreneur. So it's the hard of the market that I actually think that makes it fun.
And I think, kind of to add to both, I think that it's both easier if you're doing the right things. So I'd agree with that in the sense that people largely aren't addressing this market to a tailor fit. And so governments need effective solutions and aren't being provided them, but you have to know how to make solutions tailor fit for them. And I think that's the hard bit. I think that's why you have to both understand the technology side and understand the policy side. So when we work, we're a many-sided business model where we have to both keep citizens happy and keep government happy and keep other stakeholders happy. And that's not solely a technological problem. That's an understanding of policy problem. And you'll notice I'm smiling. The reason I'm smiling is that's also a barrier to entry, is you can't make another widget and do what we do. You have to really understand the problem that government is trying to solve. So that's a competitive advantage that you can have as you build the expertise on government. So it's a massive market that's definitely both easier to sell into because often they have a more dire problem that isn't being addressed. But it's also harder in a good way, that if you really get to know them as a market, there's much more opportunity there, and it isn't being addressed.
Well, I'm smiling for the same reasons. I mean, we really find this, and the same principles you would use to build any company, which is co-create it, do your research, figure out what problem you're trying to solve. We spent 2 years interviewing people from government. We co-created our platform with people from more than 30 governments, just like you would with any product, like a good product. So once you're in, it is much easier, and these are good people who get into government because they care about making a difference. And if you are a business that's signaling that you care about it too, it's a nice match.
So on that, I know you were just for the next question, sorry. Just really quickly, on that point, I think we are dealing with taxpayers' money here. Okay, so we're not dealing with corporate checks, and therefore there is a social responsibility which comes with selling into government. And I think you will notice a different breed of entrepreneur trying to develop these businesses, aside from what you get excited by when you hear the market opportunity statistics. And with that social responsibility comes deep accountability. Okay, so these businesses are traditionally, in my opinion, later stage. They are businesses that are more vetted, they are more credible. But they are not the huge organizations which currently take nearly 82% of all the procurement in our ecosystems. It's actually the up-and-coming disruptors who are more efficient, more innovative, and delivering better ROI for all of us.
And on that note, Ben, Lisa, what kind of motivated you to build in GovTech? And why do you think more entrepreneurs don't tackle the space?
Want to start? Go ahead.
Sure. It's the biggest problem I could come up with, to be honest. Well, I mean, if you're going to do something, it's a lot of work. Starting a company is a lot of work. Anybody who thinks it's 3 months and then it's a lot of work. And so this was the biggest problem, that nagging problem that ate at me that I could come up with. My background is public policy, and so for me, the thing I was seeing was it wasn't about health policy, it wasn't about education policy, it wasn't about transportation policy, it was what is the system with which we're making decisions, and seeing, oh, that's a really shitty system. So it's right now, the way that people give feedback to their government is largely through voting every 4 or 5 years. Actually, raise your hand. How many of you have ever been to a town hall meeting or written a letter to your government? So a town hall meeting, this is, I'm going to say 10%. The highest I've ever seen was I was at a smart city event with politically active activists. It was maybe 25%. Had ever been. So you're giving no feedback to your government. You all have expertise and insights to offer them. That's a really big problem. That's a lot of knowledge left on the table. And so for me, it was, that's the driving force, is what's the biggest problem you could come up with. The other thing, though, is it's part of what you talked about as the why is it largely not being addressed and being ignored. There's the old Peter Thiel line that everybody rolls out about what's the thing you know that everybody disagrees with you about, was huge problem that needs to be addressed, both for social reasons and economic opportunity, and also people are ignoring it. VCs are scared of it, largely, and you know, most entrepreneurs aren't focused on it. They're running against off after something that's more hot, And that's the opportunity we found and we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are three reasons why people don't do it, and I'll tell you why we went into it. I think number one is it's not sexy. I mean, you say you work in GovTech and people roll your eyes. It's not Tinder or anything like that, although we were very happy when we launched with the UK Cabinet Office. They called us the Tinder for government, which made us a little bit nervous, actually, too. It was like, what have we unleashed here? The second is, to your point, because it's new-ish. I mean, it's not really new. People have been procuring in this space for a really long time, but now that governments they're squeezed everywhere for budgets, they're looking for new solutions to new problems, and they're looking for better and cheaper solutions to old problems. And that's a really exciting place to be for entrepreneurs who actually care. So I think that part of it's that, and so there aren't a lot of VCs in the space, and so when you go to raise, they're like, well, who's leading the round? I hear people talk about this. We're like, well, there's no GovTech leading the round because there aren't that many GovTech funds, which I do think opens up another big space of impact investors who really care, who are often engaged, and foundations in this space. And then I think the third is this myth that government's really hard, and I think the biggest myth that we all deal with is that government sucks and they're not doing anything good. And the truth is that, the lights turned on today. This building hasn't collapsed, although it kind of looks like it from the outside when we came in as they're rebuilding it. There are so many good things happening in government around the world. And what inspired us to do it is I had worked in public policy and politics, and I would know of a policy working somewhere, like in Uganda, to reduce violence against women. And then I'd go to Chile and meet with the minister there, and they're like, how do we do it? We just Googled what to do. I'm like, but did you know what's going on over here? So for me, it's just a broken market that the more money you make, the more impact you have. So it's this alignment of improving people's lives with making money.
And can I add one thing there? That I think that it is that kind of understanding and appreciation of what government is actually doing is part of the problem. And so what we do is it's not just helping solve the problem, it's also helping solve the communication of you often don't know and don't trust. One of the biggest problems is there's a real question of, is Europe going to exist in 10 years? And it sounds, you might think I'm crazy. There are people at the EU Commission and the EU Parliament right now who are phrasing it that way at high levels. Because with Brexit, with lower voter turnout on the European level, the next elections are going to be really interesting. The rise of nationalism is because people don't trust their government, and people are not trusting it, especially on the EU level.
I'd say, I'd say it's not if it exists. I'd ask the question how it's going to evolve.
Sure.
And how nation states will evolve. We certainly live in an age of cities, which is actually where we see real low-hanging fruit opportunities for companies trying to sell into government, particularly local government. It's a great area of focus for us.
So George, on that note, both Ben and Lisa alluded to the fact that VCs are really not interested in the space of GovTech. How do you think about the funding climate? Is that true? Is that a myth?
Well, I think so I'm going to throw out another buzzword here. So we've heard about GovTech, we've heard about CivTech. So to give you a definition of maybe CivTech, I would say that CivTech is more focused on the citizen and providing services for the citizen, where GovTech, as I've mentioned before, is more looking at the services that you sell into a government organization to make them more agile. And there is a clear difference. So in GovTech specifically, I actually think there's quite a strong VC environment because, to be honest with you, most of the GovTech businesses we work with, they're just B2B businesses. They're B2B businesses that have scaled and they optimize their products for government. Yeah? Even if we take Dropbox as the most obvious example. Dropbox started off as a B2C service, right? It grew into a B2B proposition. Now it's trying to sell into UK government.
So you'd consider Dropbox a GovTech company?
Certainly, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean, it's selling a really useful, now secure collaboration tool for government and proving to government employees a really valuable service. So I think actually there is a lot of activity in the GovTech space. In the CivTech space, I agree with you. I don't think there is that much activity because CivTech and B2C businesses are naturally very high risk. There's huge issues with gaining critical mass of new users. Citymapper is one of our best examples of a good CivTech business in the transport space. But there's not really that many more that I can think off the top of my head.
I mean, maybe I can just outline one of our investors, Public, who you've probably intersected with somewhere in the UK. They do a GovTech listing of the top 100 GovTech companies in the UK. So we're a German company that has a subsidiary here in Berlin, because I'm based here in Berlin. So they divide up the categories, the GovTech categories, and the CivTech thing, it gets mushy and everyone has different definitions, but they talk about administration. So this is where I think you would say Dropbox would fit in. They talk about delivery. So this is anything from law enforcement to healthcare. They talk about infrastructure. So this is sensors, digital controls. So this is where we just wrote a story about how LA eases parking congestions through smart parking sensors, that sort of stuff. They talk about participation, which is the stuff that you're in. I mean, I'll tell you, there's 2,500 participatory citizen budgets happening around the world. So there's big movements. And then the last is regulation. So things like helping India, what they did, they just digitized everyone. So there are these separate categories for GovTech. What I will say is it's a really growing market in the CivTech space, because I think because it was new, people on our side weren't as good at talking about the business models, and now we're understanding the business models much more. So I'm seeing more and more funds get into the space because the lights are turning on. I don't know if you feel like that momentum is there.
I think you have to. I think it's two things. I think one, it's an issue of timing. And so if you think about how people use basic services, it's always going to hit kind of citizens, then businesses, then it's going to hit banking, legal, and government last. And so participation in what we're doing and that type of communication, a lot of it hit other markets first, but you can see that trend. And you can watch it. And you can assume that it's going to take another 10 years. When we've got our first big break, one of the people who helped us get that big break, they basically told me, I think you're going to fail, but it's really good that you try, because they said, I think it'll be another 10 years. In the last 2 years, there has been a radical shift in when we started, it was explaining to people why they needed this, why it was important. Now every day, new tenders, new legislation is making this an obligation or a requirement, so that right now it used to be you kind of were forward-looking if you were doing participation as a city, even 18, 24 months ago. Now it's looking like you should be doing it. Very quickly it's becoming, you kind of look like a city that doesn't have basic infrastructure if you don't have it. So it's kind of like not having a metro system or internet or basic electricity. So that's going to be within like 5 years. So it's partially a timing issue. I think the other part, though, that you were speaking towards is it's not just timing. It's also kind of, there's a lot of funds that just aren't don't understand the models because that's not how they made their money. Is because it's new, there are a number of VCs here that their answer is, it's great what you're doing, but I don't know how to help you. And so they made their money on e-commerce or maybe B2B, and that's what they do. Just to
give the other side, I did say there's a lot of VC interest, but they're actually, you're right, it is very hard for VCs to get into this space because, of course, VCs, they want to make a nice, big, fat exit, hopefully as quickly as possible, in most cases. So long procurement cycles with government, more uncertain kind of variables in having their startups procured, that does put a lot of VCs off. That's why
I have to push back there, just because the thing you're saying is VCs don't like it because they don't like the risk, which is kind of the game they're playing. Like talk about VCs.
They're in the risk mitigation game.
Risk mitigate, okay, but they should be looking for winners. And if they accept that the market exists, which right now we're making the compelling case for why there is a giant market and that there will be winners in it, and then it's about risk. And so what I would say kind of to that answer is the other part of my point would be you have to prove quite a bit more. You're not going to see these kind of funny deals where a guy brings in half a napkin and gets 10 million in funding. You'll see that with hot technologies. Anybody calls their half-baked idea AI or maybe blockchain. A little while ago it was IoT. They'll get money very easily. If you're doing something like CivTech, you have to prove a lot more. So my company is break-even this year. My company is making real money. And that has to happen before I can have a real conversation with VCs.
Okay, so as a VC, you all alluded to timing and market. Can you tell me a little bit about how you see governments adopting these technologies? Are they ready? We've seen some initiatives from Estonia. We've seen some initiatives from Singapore. What about the German government? What about that?
Well, what I'll say is there's a hunger around the world for this. It's being a lot driven by, I'd say, 2 or 3 things. One is that their current providers aren't solving the problems that they need to solve, so they need to look for other folks, which is exciting for companies. I think that the second reason are citizens have higher expectations now about government. Because I can go to TripAdvisor and find a lumpy bed, they want to be able to go to their government and find, or use Citymapper to find where to go. They want to go to their government and find where to get their driver's license renewed. So a lot of this is citizen-driven, which is super exciting for me. And the other is the crunch on budgets that's happening everywhere for a number of reasons. So I think there's a big demand. There is not a country. We have over 100 countries on our platform that we talk to. I'm just off the plane from Australia with the Victorian government there, the state government. I don't know a government anywhere that doesn't have someone talking about this. What I will say is, I live in Germany. We live in Germany. I would say Germany is, when you're an entrepreneur, you have to decide where not to spend your time as much as where you do need to spend your time. I wouldn't and don't spend my time talking to the German government about this. They're not early adopters. That's not a bad thing. They like things to be proven, and then they get into it, and they really do it. So our early adopters tend to be the UK, the Canadians, the Australians, the Scandinavians. You've got France in there.
How do you say, like, developing nations, like more autocratic governments, less democratic governments are probably the best markets actually to get adopted a lot quicker. That's why in Estonia, places with, historical anti-democracy have done quite well at using private citizen data to build nice blockchain ID solutions. So that's certainly an area that we push a lot of our companies, markets like that.
And the other reason Estonia did it, I was on a panel recently, and on our platform is the former CTO, the first CTO, and they just have a geography issue. Remember, Estonia is like the size. It's a pretty big country with very little people. So they had definitely issues with, they just couldn't provide services everywhere, so they had to go digital or else it would have been too expensive. So you can look for these attributes in different places that sort of are driving tech and data because they have just real geography problems. And that's also exciting for entrepreneurs to look at those, to identify it like that.
I would say, yeah, I think that's a really good point about it's very citizen-driven. So when citizens are coming and saying, we see this other places and we expect this, that moves markets very quickly. The other thing I would say is, it's now in the digital age. It's easier if you design well to go in to solve wider problems in many markets. And so I didn't build a citizen platform that only works with cities of a certain size in the French market. And that's kind of something that Eastern European countries understand well. Is they never name their company something Eastern European. They always name it something in English, something the Germans don't do very well. But it's basically what we've seen is I got a call at 7:30 in the morning 2 days ago from a guy working in the city government in Taiwan who said, oh my God, we tried to make what you're doing. Yours is 1,000 times better. Ours is really bad. Can I meet you in 2 weeks? And so they are very motivated because they understand the problem very closely, and they're finding us.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just understanding that if you're solving a real problem, there are numerous markets. I don't know that going to the autocratic ones for CivTech is the best first movement, or at least for us, I think you have to be.
I was talking more about kind of procurement frameworks,
sure.
A lot more flexible.
I think on civic tech it's a little dicier, but yeah.
But what you say around like geography being almost like a limiter, I think what's also a big limiter in the market is verticals. Like you hear so much about these programs, like, oh, it's a fintech program, oh, it's a madtech program. And essentially a lot of these great businesses, they're very vertical specific. Like you run data companies, you run blockchain companies. Why are you a defense startup? And you mentioned Public created some of these verticals.
Just categories. No, they're just categorizing.
We've stopped categorizing startups. Because there's huge scale opportunities in this space. So the way I like to think about it is more horizontal and verticals. So your horizontals are your cybersecurity, machine learning, for example, your HR technologies. Like you could almost map to departments in businesses. But then your verticals, of course, your industries. And the best horizontal businesses, the scalable ones that we want to invest in, are the ones that can essentially be a horizontal across all the different verticals. So I think we need to get out of the business, especially in GovTech, of identifying verticals for our businesses, because they're doomed, then they're set up to fail. You know.
I would say the only thing I'd add there is kind of the assumption is you can start B2B and then move into B2G after you've grown. What we actually found in our research was it was easier for us to start with government for a couple reasons. One was when what we solve, kind of consensus building, can be done with companies, can be done with large organizations. We could have gone B2B first very easily. But what we found was that the risk for them was spread across like 8 different departments. So I had to get the CEO on the phone to sign off on a deal, versus with government, there was a guy who this was his problem or her problem, and that's a much easier thing to sell into. So we've actually started with B2G, starting working with cities and government, and now we're starting to work with consultancies, private companies, utility companies, consultancies that understand the problem similarly, but in a different context. And so you can also start with government and work your way backwards in a way as well.
And we chose to do that too, because one of the things we're doing is we're sitting on and creating lots of data and trends around policies and procurements around the world. And if we didn't start and really co-create with government, we wouldn't have the trust in the brand to have governments engage with us. And that's the business intelligence tool that the other sectors are really looking for. So if we went and built it for business first, you can't retrofit for government. It's very, very difficult with that sort of business. If it's Dropbox, you can, because it's just basically scaling a service that you do in a different way, and you have a different vertical. But I do find, like, even LinkedIn, who, you know, how many people have LinkedIn? Like, most people have LinkedIn. Governments aren't using it very much because there's this trust factor that they have with it. So I feel like for GovTech companies, because they have citizens' money, the brand is actually pretty important if you're in this sort of data and policy space. It may not be as important if you're in this administrative function space, although I'm seeing more and more stress on procurement actually having social screens from particular governments.
I completely agree with your point on you can go B2G first. So I used to work for a competitor of Dropbox back 5 years ago called Huddle. I was the head of enterprise technology there, and I sold into the public sector and did all the technical requirements and digital transformation. And they started off with government. The reason why was because, obviously, in the States, like, you have a large majority of investors with much deeper pockets, and B2C models where you have to put a ton of cash into marketing and loss lead for many years, it requires that amount of investment. And back then in the UK, you just didn't have that. So you see a lot of UK businesses with, you know, potential applications for B2C going B2B first and B2G first. There's also something in the UK called the G-Cloud framework, which I'm sure you're familiar with. This is something that I helped get Huddle on. It took me 4.5 months of 9 to 5 grinds to go through the security matrices and tick boxes to get Huddle onto that G-Cloud framework. This is essentially a framework that you get pre-vetted, and then once you're on it, you can get procured very easy with a credit card. Highly recommend it if you're looking to sell into UK government. But just to sum up my point, though, I do agree, yeah, you can go B2G.
You'll notice all of us dodged the Germany question. No, you
I
got
directed
there.
it.
Yeah, but we kind of nobody really wanted to like say it honestly. But yeah, I wouldn't start with Germany if you want to do civic tech or GovTech.
No, it's not wrong. They'll let somebody else pay for the risk, and then they'll adopt it. It's kind of clever.
Yeah, they might be 10 years.
So on that point, we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about the status quo of the GovTech market. We've talked about timing, we've talked about market, some of the obstacles operationally of building these companies. I'd love to think about it looking forward. What do you think are the future trends in GovTech? What do you think the future looks like for this industry?
You want to start?
Okay, so I think the big opportunity we're going to see in the next 5 years is within cities. I mentioned this before. There's a great Wellington Webb quote. I think it's always good to throw at least one quote on a panel. So he said, you know, the 19th century was all about empires and colonies, and the 20th century was all about nation states. The 21st century is about cities. Urbanization, globalization, 87% of UK GDP is coming out of London. I don't know much about the German market, which is why I skipped the last question. So I will keep talking about the UK. I apologise. The Bank of England governor even came out and said, look, guys, if you want to invest a pound in the UK, please do it in London. It's the only place you're going to get the return. That's our governor of the Bank of England saying that. So cities and mega cities who are now coming out of places like China. You've got Macau, Hong Kong, Shenzhen joining up to become mega cities. You've got Saudi Arabia building a $500 billion mega city, which is 10 times the size of New York. It's certainly the age of that. So your space and the opportunity within cities is huge. We're also going to see a lot more city-to-city collaboration as they become their own devoluted, decentralized organisms, which are going to have the majority of trade, investment, talent coming through them. So I'm really interested in how cities are going to start to share best practice, share tools and technologies, and then eventually the mature platforms which are going to come out to facilitate that type of collaboration.
So I see a big trend in public-private partnerships because governments don't know how to solve these new problems, particularly in areas of data and AI and machine learning and IoT. We get requests from people in government all the time saying, I just got moved from the suicide prevention division to the IoT division. What should I read about IoT? That's how public administration works. So I'm seeing that the only way that they'll be able to solve some of these problems is to work with companies. And they're very open to that. There is a revolution going on in procurement right now. A whole way of thinking is changing because of that in government, which has to make you more risk open, which means you have to communicate differently to citizens, and you have to carve out that risk so you don't hurt people. I mean, just think autonomous cars right now. Are you going to be the person that legislates go when something horrible happens? So it's a space that is going to be sort of moving back and forth, but I am totally bullish, not just because we're in the market. You just look at the trends, and there's massive opportunity. I just want to say one thing about the city and rural. While it is very true that cities are where we're at, where we're going, we still have people living in rural areas. And if we want to know why there's a political divide in the world, whether it be Brexit or the voters here in Germany, it's because we haven't thought through the rural challenges. And so we're really proud to be looking at some of those policies that the governments can be using technology, such as coding schools and increasing broadband, to make sure that these people aren't left out. Because when they're left out, they get very pissed off.
And they're voters, and you don't want to piss off voters.
You don't want to piss off voters.
I don't want to sound like an anarchist here, but I mean, you've heard about Northern Powerhouse, you hear about these schemes to look at supporting the rest of the country. From an economic utilitarian perspective, it seems very inefficient. I
mean, government's role is to manage transition. That's really one of, and we're in the biggest transition ever, and that means their workforce is going through that transition too. So I'm very bullish. Inc. magazine said that GovTech was the top 8 industries to invest in a few years ago, and I see there a big opportunity to make money and to make a big change in the world.
Well, I'd agree. I think for me, I have 3 thoughts. For all of you who don't work in GovTech or CivTech, think about the problem you're solving and think about how that's going to affect the government or the city over the next 20 years. And then you understand the problem and the immensity of the problem. And so I met with a large company that works in the Netherlands yesterday, and they basically said right now the government has to plan 20,000 housing spaces in a city. And that's going to take, it's going to be over the next 20 years. But we have to think about autonomous cars. We have to plan for 20 years from now. Now. That's a very hard challenge. So it's anything that AI, blockchain, all the other technologies that you might be interested in, is all you have to do is think about how that's going to screw everything. Think about 20 years ago, the internet, and how drastically that's changed everything. And now think about all the problems that are getting tackled now and how that's going to shift again everything. And they need to keep up. They can't design a town today that in 20 years is going to be completely obsolete. That's just not the planning timeline they work on. So they have to be forward thinking. Part of how they need to do that, and that's where we try to come in, is in 2 ways. One, not making decisions in isolation. And so we run a program right now where it's actually them working with other cities so that they learn from each other. They're all dealing with very similar problems. They need to be learning from each other. Different cities, we also work rurally. Our smallest customer is a town of like 20,000 up to regions of several million. And so you have to be able to address kind of everybody, but you have to know that they need to learn from each other and want to learn from each other. But the other thing I would say is they shouldn't be making those decisions in isolation as a city or in isolation as those decision makers. This is why we believe in civic tech, is essentially they're going to make bad decisions on their own. And so we're in a post-paternalistic society. It's you expect to be engaged with them and make decisions with them, and you should. And so because of that, if we're going to actually address these problems and plan appropriately, you have to involve citizens in that process, or you're going to make bad decisions.
Yeah, and as we're obviously at a data conference, I think one thing I'd like to bring up is the opportunity in data over the next 5 years. And we hear a lot about open data, which has been largely inefficient in the types of valuable open data that's been released. And I imagine for many data scientists in the crowd, how useful that data and how clean it is to actually use for your applications. The other type of data that we have started to crunch over the last couple of years doing this is, so on average, we used to close between 20 to 30 procurements into the public sector over about a 3-month period. The median value of our procurements are about 50K. We accelerate pipelines by about 150% on average over 3 months and increase valuations by over 30%. As soon as we started crunching procurement data, so openly available procurement data, to start to match companies with the key kind of data points that government was looking for, things that, like, for example, budget cycles, decision maker layouts and hierarchies, we started to increase that dramatically, and we're now looking at 60 to 70 procurements on average every 3 months with our portfolios. So data is not just all about CivTech and the open data opportunity you see with services and apps. It's also how can you leverage data to be able to enable better procurement. So that's a big area of focus for us.
And maybe two just things for the audience to think about. So one is, if you are a startup person, an entrepreneur, or a business person, governments, not all, but many governments want you. They really, really, really want you. The US has started an entrepreneur in residence program that's been replicated in the Netherlands. It's been replicated in Sweden. They want people to come out of your businesses and go into government for a while and then go back into the businesses. So think about doing that. It's great for helping the world, and you learn a lot of intelligence to go start your next business. Because of this big demand, we're launching Q1 of next year a marketplace to help GovTech and CivTech companies find people in government that are looking for them. Governments have come to us and said, we need to find someone doing participatory budgeting, and you find that someone's worked in France, but this is in Victoria, and they didn't hear about you because it's not the news. So if you have a company that's selling into government or wants to be, come find me. It's going to be a matching platform that's been driven by demand for government, meant to really serve the entire GovTech CivTech field.
And on that note, we're out of time. I want to give a huge thank you to Ben, Lisa, and George for this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.